Somewhere in your pocket or close enough, there is a piece of a company you have never heard the real story of. Not the phone. Nobody has made a Nokia phone in over a decade. The network underneath it, though, that's a different question. Every time your call connects, there's a real chance it passes through hardware built by a company still called Nokia. Base stations, fiber backbone, the unglamorous plumbing that makes a text message arrive. Nokia today books somewhere around 19 to 20 billion euros a year. It employs roughly 70,000 people. It sits inside a tiny club of three companies, alongside Ericsson and Huawei, that actually build the equipment carriers use to run mobile networks. It also owns one of the deepest patent portfolios in wireless technology. Nokia holds thousands of patents essential to how 4G and 5G networks function, which is why phone makers who have never done business with Nokia directly still send it a licensing check every year. It gets paid every time a phone that isn't a Nokia connects to a network anyway. You probably think of Nokia, if you think of it at all, as the company that made the phone you couldn't break. The one with the snake game. Announced in September 2000, the Nokia 3310 was expected to sell 20 million units. It sold 126 million. It weighed 133 grams, ran for the better part of a week on a single charge, and became genuinely famous for surviving drops, spills, and abuse that would kill anything made today. 3 years later, the Nokia 1100 went even further. Over 250 million units sold between 2003 and 2009, priced under $50, built dust-resistant for markets across India, China, and Africa. It's still, by unit count, the best-selling single electronic device ever made. More than any iPhone model, more than any PlayStation. That company is dead. It was sold off in 2000. What's left, wearing the same name, does something almost nobody outside the telecom industry could describe. Here's the part that should stop you. That isn't even close to the strangest thing about this company. Nokia began in 1865 as a groundwood pulp mill on a river in southwestern Finland, built by a mining engineer named Fredrik Idestam to grind wood into paper. No electronics, no phones, no cables even, not yet. Paper. For over 100 years after that, Nokia made paper, then rubber boots, then tires, then electrical cable. It only picked up a phone commercially, seriously, in the 80s. It has now spent more of its history not making phones than making them. That's the gap you need to sit with before any of the rest of this makes sense. Nokia is not really a phone company, and it never really was, not in the way the story gets told. It is a 160-year-old cash recycling machine that happened to bolt a phone factory onto itself for about 20 years. It made an enormous amount of money doing it. Then it unbolted the factory and kept going. The phones were the loudest 20 years. They were not the point. If that reframe is right, the interesting question isn't how Nokia built a phone empire. Plenty of companies have done that once. The interesting question is how a paper mill outlived rubber, outlived cable, outlived phones, and is still standing while almost everyone who beat it at each of those individual games is gone. Start with the actual founding, because the details matter more than the date. In 1865, Fredrik Idestam got a concession to build a groundwood pulp mill at the Tamarkoski Rapids in the town of Tampere. Finland at the time was a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire, not yet an independent country. That wouldn't happen until 1917. Idestam needed a strong, cheap, reliable current to power his grinding machinery, and the Tamarkoski Rapids gave him that. The mill opened in 1866. 2 years later, in 1868, he built a second, better-positioned mill 15 kilometers away on the Nokian-Virta River next to a small town called Nokia. In 1871, he formalized the business with a friend, the economist and politician Leo Mechelin, and incorporated it as Nokia AB. It was named after the river and the town, not the other way around. You are watching a company get its name from its zip code, essentially, more than a century and a half before anyone would ever recognize that name on a phone. This is not a glamorous start. A pulp mill is not a garage with a visionary in it. It is a capital-intensive commodity business. It lives or dies on the price of wood, the price of paper, and the strength of the river. Idestam's real skill wasn't invention. Groundwood pulping was already known technology in Europe. His skill was picking the site, securing the concession, and building the capacity to compete on cost. An engineering and logistics skill, not a spark of genius one. Remember that It comes back. The first real pivot didn't happen for almost a century. In 1907, Nokia AB merged with two other Finnish industrial firms into a single entity, Nokia Corporation. The Finnish Rubber Works, founded 1898, made rubber boots and tires. The Finnish Cable Works, founded 1912, made telegraph, telephone, and power cable. This wasn't a hostile takeover or an act of empire building. The Finnish government actively encouraged it. Finland in the mid-1960s wanted fewer, stronger industrial champions rather than a scatter of mid-sized firms competing each other into the ground. And it leaned on banks and institutional shareholders to make consolidation happen. 3 separate businesses, 1 balance sheet. Here's why that detail is the whole story and not just trivia. The Finnish Cable Works had a small, unglamorous electronics division, built originally to service its own telecom cable business, testing equipment, radio transmitters, that sort of thing. Bolted onto a paper company and a rubber company, that electronics division suddenly had access to capital it would never have raised on its own. A radio equipment side project inside a mid-sized cable manufacturer is a rounding error. The same side project inside a diversified industrial group with steady cash from boots and paper is a bet somebody can actually afford to make. Picture the layout for a second. Pulped wood fiber drying in one wing of the operation. Rolls of raw rubber stacked in another. Spooled copper cable in a third. And in a back office, a handful of engineers soldering prototype radio sets that nobody outside Scandinavia had ever asked for. Nothing about this configuration was designed. It was just what a century of unrelated mergers happened to leave sitting next to each other in the same annual report. By the late 1970s, that electronics arm, descended from a telegraph and cable company, itself now folded into a paper and rubber conglomerate, was building mobile radio telephone systems for the Nordic market. In 1979, Nokia and a Finnish television maker called Salora set up a joint venture by Mobira, specifically to build car phones and, eventually, portable ones. 4 industries in one building, paper on one floor, rubber boots on another, telephone cable in a third. And now, in a back room nobody important was watching closely, men building radios you could theoretically carry. None of this was inevitable. There is no natural line from a pulp mill in 1865 to a mobile phone in 1979. There is a very traceable line from a government-brokered merger of unrelated industrial firms in 1907 to a mobile phone in 1909. That merger is what put a spare, adventurous electronics team inside a company with enough spare cash to feed it. By 1980, Nokia was, on paper, a boring industrial conglomerate with decent margins in 3 low-growth, capital-heavy businesses. Rubber boots do not surprise anyone. Neither does cable. The mobile radio side project, Mobira, the joint venture with Salora, was a tiny fraction of group revenue. The executives running the paper and rubber divisions, which still generated the bulk of Nokia's profit through the early 1980s, were not shy about saying so internally. This was a hobby funded by real businesses that had not yet made real money. In 1982, Mobira released the Senator, a car phone weighing close to 10 kilograms, built for the newly launched Nordic Mobile Telephone Network, the first international cellular network in the world, switched on across Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland that same year. It cost the equivalent of several $1,000s. It needed a car battery to run for any length of time. A handheld follow-up, the Mobira Talkman, arrived in 1984 at just under 5 kilograms. Smaller than a car phone. Not pocketable by any definition you'd recognize today. Here's the number that makes this a genuine bet rather than a safe diversification. Nordic Mobile Telephone, at launch in 1981, had roughly 10,000 subscribers across 4 countries combined. Say Mobira had $5 million sunk into tooling, certification, and engineering to serve that market. That's a conservative figure for standing up a new handset line from scratch. 5 million divided by 10,000 is $500 of committed costs sitting on every single subscriber who might, theoretically, one day buy a phone. Before Mobira had sold one. Inside the conglomerate, the paper and rubber executives who controlled the board were not wrong to be skeptical. Nothing about the mobile telephone in 1982 looked like a product. It looked like a science project with a price tag, chasing a subscriber base a single sales rep could plausibly have called individually. The consensus view, inside and outside the company, was blunt. Car phones were a niche for wealthy executives and emergency services, not a mass consumer category. Nokia's real future was in industrial cable and consumer rubber goods, the businesses that had actually made money every year since the 1960s. What the electronics team was betting on instead was a curve nobody around that boardroom table had strong reason to believe in yet. The cost of the radio components inside the phone would fall fast enough. The cellular networks would expand fast enough. A 10,000 subscriber niche in 1981 would become a mass market within a decade. That is not a crazy bet in hindsight. In 1982, though, with a 5-kilogram handset and a 4-country network the size of a large office's headcount, it was the wrong call by any normal capital allocation logic available at the time. It kept getting funded anyway for one reason. The paper mill and the rubber factory were still profitable enough every single year to cover the loss without anyone at Nokia having to go to a bank and explain themselves. That's the entire mechanism. Not vision, not a founder's insistence. A century-old cash-generating asset base, large enough that a genuinely speculative bet could sit inside it for a decade without threatening the whole structure. Take away the paper mill and the mobile phone business almost certainly gets canceled sometime around 1984. To any reasonable person holding the balance sheet, it still looked like a hobby that had gone on a few years too long. It shouldn't have worked. It worked because it was never actually betting its own money. Fast forward to 1991, and Nokia's board faced a version of the same choice every founder eventually faces, just at conglomerate scale: keep spreading your risk or concentrate it. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, taking a major export market with it. Finland was in the worst banking crisis in its modern history. Nokia posted a pre-tax loss of roughly $102 million that year. Its consumer electronics division, televisions largely, had lost close to $1 billion across the 5 years from 1988 to 1993. The company that had survived 126 years by never depending on any single product now had 5 product lines bleeding at once. Its board had to decide what to keep. One path: stay diversified. Paper, rubber, cable, power generation, consumer electronics, and this small, unproven mobile telephone unit. 6 businesses, none individually essential, the same structure that had carried the company since 19. Spreading risk across 6 industries meant no single bad year in any one of them could sink the whole company. It had worked for over a century. The argument for staying the course wasn't nostalgia. It was that diversification is, historically, exactly what had kept this specific company alive when its single-product competitors died. The other path? Sell almost everything and go all in on mobile telephony. In 1991, that business was still a rounding error next to paper and rubber. It ran on a cellular standard that only existed in a handful of countries. It competed against far larger, better-funded electronics giants who had been making consumer devices for decades. Concentrating meant Nokia would no longer be a diversified industrial company that happened to dabble in phones. It would be a phone company, full stop, with no paper mill left to cover a bad quarter. Both cases are honestly arguable. The board making this call in the early 1990s did not have the hindsight you're reading this with. Stay diversified, and you keep the safety net that already saved you once. But you're also asking a management team to run 6 unrelated businesses adequately instead of one business brilliantly, in an era when focused competitors were starting to win. Concentrate on mobile, and you get the focus, the capital, and the management attention a genuinely fast-moving technology market demands. But you've just deleted the exact mechanism, the cross-subsidy, that let the phone bet survive its first unprofitable decade in the first place. Nokia, under incoming CEO Jorma Ollila, who took over in January 1992, chose to concentrate. Between 1991 and 1996, it sold off the cable business, the power business, and the rubber and tire operations. It sold the television and consumer electronics division too, keeping only mobile phones and network infrastructure. Whichever path a company like this takes, it has just locked in what kind of crisis it will have next. Nokia had just traded a portfolio of small, manageable crises for the possibility of one enormous one. 20 years down the line, in a business it no longer had anything left to fall back on. Here's a question worth sitting with before you go any further. Which is worth more? A company that does one thing brilliantly, or a company that does 5 different things adequately all at once? Read that again. Which of those two is worth more? Almost everyone's instinct says the specialist. Focus wins, conventional wisdom says. Pick a lane, dominate it, don't dilute your best people across mediocre side businesses. It's the advice in every startup book written in the last 20 years. For a huge number of companies, it's correct. But it is not what actually kept Nokia alive, and the mechanism is worth spelling out in full because it's the single most misunderstood part of this company's history. A specialist company that does one thing brilliantly has one clock. When that clock runs out, the market shifts, a cheaper competitor arrives, the underlying technology gets disrupted. The company has nothing else to fall back on. There's no other source of cash to survive the transition while it figures out what comes next. Nobody claps for adequate. A diversified company that does 5 things adequately has 5 clocks running on different schedules. As long as 1 or 2 of them are still generating cash, the company can fund a bet on whichever clock is about to become the important one. It doesn't need any of its 5 businesses to be brilliant. It needs enough of them to be solvent at the same time, often enough. That is the whole trick, and it looks nothing like genius from the outside. That's the actual engine behind Nokia, and it isn't a story about a visionary founder. It's a structural fact about conglomerates with genuinely unrelated divisions and shared capital. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, Nokia's paper and rubber divisions were mature, low growth, and reliably profitable. Not exciting, dependable, throwing off cash every year almost regardless of the broader economy. That cash didn't have to be reinvested in more paper mills because the paper market wasn't growing fast enough to absorb it usefully. It got redirected inside one balance sheet into the electronics division's mobile telephone research, which for most of the 1970s and 1980s was not profitable on its own. Try the arithmetic. Say the paper and rubber divisions together were throwing off something in the range of $50 to $80 million a year in free cash through the 1970s. That's a plausible range for mature Nordic industrial operations of that size. Say the mobile telephone R&D budget in any given year of that decade sat somewhere around $5 to $10 million, a fraction of that surplus. The mature businesses weren't just covering the bet. They were covering it several times over, with room to spare for a bad year. The phone division didn't need to compete for capital against paper and rubber. It needed paper and rubber to not need all their own cash back, and for most of 2 decades, they didn't. This is the cash recycling machine from the opening, made concrete. Money moving from boots and paper into an unproven radio, decade after decade, because the machine could afford to wait. There's a second layer to this engine, and it's specific to Finland, not something you can copy just by owning a conglomerate. The Finnish state, through its banks and its direct involvement in industrial policy, actively supported this consolidation and its export ambitions. The 1967 merger itself happened partly because the government wanted fewer, stronger national champions, rather than a field of mid-sized firms competing each other into weakness. A small country with a small domestic market had every incentive to help one company get big enough to export successfully, rather than watch 5 smaller companies fail to. Historians of the period are fairly direct about this. Without that institutional backing, in a small economy with limited private capital markets, it's difficult to see how an electronics side project inside a paper and rubber company survives long enough to matter. Put those 2 things together: internal cross-subsidy from mature divisions, external backing from a state that needed this specific bet to work, and you get the actual answer to the thought experiment. The 5 things adequately company was worth more in Nokia's specific case because being adequate at paper and rubber bought it 2 full decades of runway to become brilliant at something else entirely. The specialist company that had bet everything on phones from day one, with no paper mill behind it, would have run out of money by 1985. It would never have gotten the chance to find out if the bet was right. By 2007, the bet had paid off beyond anything that 1982 boardroom could have imagined. Nokia held 51% of the global mobile phone market that year. More than 1 in every 2 handsets sold on Earth was a Nokia. The company sold 437 million phones in 2007 alone and booked 51.5 billion euros in revenue. Do the arithmetic on that for a second. 51.5 billion divided by 437 million works out to roughly 118 euros of revenue per phone on average. That's across every market from Lagos to Los Angeles, from the cheapest feature phone to the priciest smartphone in the lineup. That is an extraordinary business to be running. It is also, as it turned out, close to the peak. Apple had launched the iPhone that same year, 2007. Nokia's board, by most later accounts, did not consider it an immediate threat. A phone with no physical keyboard, a battery that struggled through a full day, aimed at a premium slice of the market Nokia already dominated with cheaper, more durable hardware. That read was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that compounded fast. By the end of 2008, Nokia's global share had already slipped from 51% to just over 40%. It would not stop sliding for the next 5 years. In April 2011 alone, Nokia announced 7,000 layoffs as it wound down Symbian, the operating system that had powered its smartphones for a decade. It was discarded in favor of an unproven partnership with Microsoft's Windows Phone. 51% to sold off in 6 years. The stock tells the story in a single line. Nokia shares hit an all-time high around €65 in June of 2000, during the peak of the dot-com telecom boom. By July of 2012, they had fallen to €1.33. Run that number. From €65 down to €1.33 is a decline of roughly 98%. Not a correction, not a rough patch. 98% of the company's market value gone over 12 years, with most of the real damage landing in the final 5. In September 2010, Nokia announced it was selling its entire handset business to Microsoft for $7.2 billion. The phones, the brand license for phones, the factories, all of it. The deal closed in April 2000. The company that had built the best-selling consumer electronics product in human history, at that point no longer made phones at all. What was left behind, network infrastructure, patents, became the actual Nokia going forward, the one still standing today. Here's the detail that tells you this wasn't a soft landing for anyone. Microsoft wrote off $7.6 billion related to that acquisition within about 2 years of closing it. That's more than the $7.2 billion it originally paid. Roughly 18,000 jobs were cut across the unit in the first round of post-acquisition layoffs. 12,500 of them were people who had until very recently worked for Nokia. The company that bought the crown jewel of Finnish engineering effectively concluded, in writing on its own balance sheet, that the crown jewel was worth less than nothing. That's within 2 years of paying for it. Nokia wasn't the only handset maker who hit this wall, and looking at who didn't survive it tells you something Nokia's own history doesn't, on its own. Motorola invented the first handheld mobile phone back in 1973, more than a decade before Nokia's Talkman. It held 21% of the global handset market in 2006. By 2011, that share had collapsed to 2%. The company lost $4.3 billion between 2007 and 2009 alone, trying to catch up to the smartphone shift. Motorola had no century-old paper mill sitting behind it. It had no diversified conglomerate structure to absorb the loss while it retooled. Its mobile division was split off and sold to Google in 2012 for $12.5 billion. Then resold to Lenovo just 2 years later, in 2000, for $2.9 billion. Google kept the patent portfolio, worth an estimated $5.5 billion on its own, and let the actual phone business go for a fraction of what it paid. Put the two side by side. Nokia survived the collapse of its core product by selling the product and keeping the infrastructure and the patents underneath it. That's the exact same cross-subsidy structure, one more time. Just with the phone itself in the role the paper mill used to play. Motorola had built one brilliant thing and nothing else to fall back on when that thing stopped working. Same collapse, same decade, same industry. One of those two companies is still on the stock exchange under its own name. The other one isn't. There are 2 ways to tell you what happened to Nokia after 2000, and both of them are partly true. The version the company tells, if you read its own materials, is a story of focus and discipline. Nokia returned to its engineering roots. It doubled down on the infrastructure business it actually understood best. It is now a global leader in 5G network technology, powering a meaningful share of the mobile traffic on Earth. That is not spin. It's largely accurate. Nokia today holds one of the largest patent portfolios in wireless communications and remains one of a handful of companies capable of building network equipment at global carrier scale. The version the numbers support is less flattering and more interesting. Nokia's core competency across 160 years has never actually been paper or rubber or cable or phones or network infrastructure. It has been staying solvent long enough in whatever business it currently occupies to fund the next one before the current one runs out. Phones were not the destination. They were the second to last stop on a route the company has been running since 1865. But there's no obvious reason the current stop is the last one either. That structure had a real cost, and it's worth naming honestly rather than treating this as an unambiguous success story. A company willing to abandon any single product line the moment it stops paying for itself is not a company you can build lasting brand loyalty around. Ask anyone who owned a Nokia phone in 2010 how they feel about the brand now. The phones sold under that name today are made under license since 2000 by a completely different company, HMD Global. It has no operational connection to the Nokia that made the network gear their old handset used to run on. Most people who buy one have no idea the two companies aren't the same. The cross-subsidy that saved the company, again and again, also means nobody who ever loved a specific version of Nokia ever got to keep it. So, is it repeatable? Can another company do what Nokia did? Pivot 4 times across a century and a half and still be standing? Structurally, yes, if it has what Nokia had. A diversified capital base large enough to fund an unproven bet for a decade without threatening the core. And the discipline to sell off even a business it loves the moment the numbers say to. Most companies don't have both of those at once. Most companies that have the capital lack the discipline and keep funding a dying division out of loyalty. Most companies that have the discipline never had the diversified capital base to begin with. Nokia is not really a phone company, and it never was. It is a 160-year-old cash recycling machine that has now bolted and unbolted 4 different products onto the same balance sheet. From a Tampere riverbank in 1865 to a network operations center today, the only real brand loyalty it has ever shown is to staying alive.